There is a conductor at Norfolk Southern who has been working the rails for 35 years without a single reported injury on his record. The company gave him an award, a plaque, a ceremony, and all the things you do when you want to celebrate an employee who kept his head down and did his job and never caused any problems. The very next day, he blacks out in the locomotive, falls down the steps, and hits his head on the way down. When he wakes up, he does exactly what you are supposed to do in that situation. He reports the injury to his supervisor. Within weeks, Norfolk Southern hauls him into a disciplinary hearing and accuses him of making false and conflicting statements, falsifying a report, and everything else they can think of. By the time the dust settles, this man with a 35-year record of exemplary service has been fired for reporting a head injury that happened the day after the railroad shook his hand. That is where we are in the American freight rail industry in 2026. If you think this is an isolated incident, a rogue manager, or a misunderstanding that got out of hand, you should know that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has been documenting this pattern for over a decade, and the numbers are staggering. Between 2007 and 2012, OSHA received more than 900 whistleblower complaints under the Federal Railroad Safety Act, and 63% of those complaints involved workers who said they were punished for reporting an on-the-job injury. Not for faking an injury, not for lying about an injury, but for the simple act of telling their supervisor that something had happened to them while they were doing their job on railroad property. The way it works is actually quite simple once you understand the incentives at play. Federal regulations require railroads to report any injury that results in a worker getting prescription medication, missing time from work, or being assigned to light duty. And those reports go to the Federal Railroad Administration and become part of the railroad's official safety record. And that safety record is something the executives like to brag about to shareholders, customers, and the public. So when a worker gets hurt and reports it, the railroad has two choices. They can accept that the injury happened, investigate what caused it, and fix whatever hazard led to someone getting hurt. Or they can investigate the worker instead and find some reason to claim the injury report was false, late, or inconsistent, and then fire the worker for dishonesty rather than for reporting an injury. And that second option is exactly what has been happening across this industry for decades. ProPublica spent over a year examining this problem, and what they found was that every single one of America's 6 largest freight railroads has settled lawsuits with workers who alleged they were retaliated against for reporting injuries. They identified 111 federal court cases where workers made these claims. Nearly 60% of those cases ended with the railroads paying settlements to make them go away. 3 cases in recent years resulted in jury verdicts of over $1 million for workers who were wrongfully terminated. The railroad's favorite excuse is something called late reporting. Every carrier has a rule requiring injuries to be reported immediately or before the end of the shift. There are many legitimate reasons a worker might not report an injury right away. Maybe they are in shock. Maybe they think they can walk it off. Maybe they are miles from anywhere and are trying to finish their run. When they do finally report it, the railroad seizes on that delay and says they are not firing you for reporting an injury. They are firing you for violating their injury reporting rules. That sounds like a distinction with a difference, but for years, some judges actually bought that argument. The Supreme Court shut that defense down in 2024. The ruling makes clear that if the injury report was a contributing factor in the decision to fire someone, the railroad loses unless it can prove it would have taken the same action anyway. Good luck proving that, when the only reason you even knew about the supposed rule violation was because the worker told you they got hurt. What makes this whole system even more perverse is that the managers conducting these investigations are themselves operating under a compensation structure that rewards them for keeping injury numbers low. ProPublica found that railroad supervisors can earn bonuses of $20,000 to $25,000 a year on top of their base salary, depending on their performance evaluations. Those evaluations include metrics around safety incidents and injury rates, which means every injury a worker reports is an injury that threatens the manager's bonus. One BNSF track inspector named Don Sanders actually recorded his manager berating him for writing up too many defects. On that recording, you can hear the manager, a division engineer named Keith Jones, saying that he is about to lose his job and his family's welfare because of what Sanders is flagging. After Sanders was fired for what BNSF claimed was time theft and not retaliation, Jones received a glowing performance review that literally said his team was injury-free, slow orders were at an all-time low, relationships were good, and Don Sanders was no longer working for BNSF. There is a man named Bobby Moran who worked as a machinist at Union Pacific. He suffered a work injury that permanently damaged his hand and cost him 2 fingers. Union Pacific fired him after the incident. Another worker at Canadian Pacific Kansas City smashed his knee in August 2024 when his leg fell between the railroad ties. While he lay in a hospital getting an X-ray, his manager called him repeatedly. The manager offered whatever he needed over the counter, anything at all, as long as he did not take prescription drugs. The manager said prescription medication triggers a mandatory report to federal regulators. The Federal Railroad Administration has acknowledged that this culture of fear exists and that it affects safety across the industry. Its chief safety officer told reporters that worker fear is real and that it influences safety for the worse. He said there is a yawning gap between what he hears from executives at headquarters and what actually happens on the ground, where managers face unrealistic expectations and do whatever they can to meet them. And when you look at the cases that have come through OSHA and the federal courts, you can see exactly what happens to workers who dare to speak up. Norfolk Southern has paid out millions of dollars in sanctions over the past 15 years for retaliating against injured workers. Union Pacific has been labeled a serial violator of the Federal Railroad Safety Act by OSHA itself. CSX received 3 separate OSHA merit findings in a single 10-month period for retaliating against workers who reported safety concerns. The most disturbing part is what this culture does to the workers who stay silent. There was a runaway train incident in Grenada, Mississippi. A train carrying explosive cargo lost control, and the workers involved were so afraid of what would happen to them that they refused to report it to federal regulators. The only reason anyone found out was because someone else sent a text message to an FRA official a week later. A union vice president said the employees felt they could not acknowledge or report it for fear of retribution. And this was a train with hazardous materials on board. When OSHA sanctioned Norfolk Southern in 2011, the agency noted that the railroad's culture of employee harassment and intimidation allowed the company to maintain the appearance of an exemplary safety record. That phrase captures exactly what is happening here. The railroads are not actually safer, they are just better at punishing the people who would make their problems visible. The Smart Union put it plainly in a recent statement. The railroad industry has more improperly terminated workers than almost any other job field in America. The result is a culture of silence and an industry left in the dark when it comes to safety. The union pointed to East Palestine as the ultimate example of what happens when workers are too afraid to speak up. When long-standing safety complaints about inspection practices and defect detectors go unaddressed because nobody wants to be the next person hauled into a kangaroo court hearing for reporting something the railroad did not want to hear about. That is where we are in the freight rail industry in 2026, watching workers choose between their health and their careers, while the railroads collect bonuses for safety records that exist only on paper.